He thought his days of purpose were long behind him until he saw what they were doing to her. A woman beaten for birthing daughters, a town too afraid to help, and one rancher who decided enough was enough. What happened next changed everything. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked this story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The scorching Arizona sun beat down on the dusty road leading to Willow Creek, a small settlement nestled between rolling hills and sparse vegetation. The year was 1885, and life in the western frontier was as unforgiving as the landscape itself. Thomas Barrett, a solitary rancher with calloused hands and weathered skin, rode his chestnut mare toward town for his monthly supplies. At 42, Thomas had long ago resigned himself to a life of solitude. His ranch, 20 miles outside of town, was his sanctuary and prison all at once. The death of his wife Sarah during childbirth 15 years prior had left him a shell of a man, focused only on his cattle and the day-to-day struggles of frontier life. "Come on, Penny," he murmured to his horse as they approached the general store. "Let's get what we need and head back before nightfall." Dismounting with practiced ease, Thomas secured Penny to the hitching post and adjusted his worn leather hat. The town was busier than usual, with wagons and horses lining the main street. As he stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, a commotion from behind the Richardson homestead caught his attention. The sound was unmistakable, the crack of a whip, followed by a woman's muffled cry. Thomas hesitated, his jaw tightening. The affairs of others were not his concern, especially those of the Richardson family, known for their wealth and influence in the county. But the second crack of the whip and another pained cry compelled him forward. Moving between buildings, he came upon a scene that stopped him cold. In the Richardsons' backyard, a young woman was tied to a post, her dress torn at the back, angry red welts visible on her exposed skin. Standing over her was Jeremiah Richardson, his face contorted with rage, whip in hand. His wife Martha looked on, her expression a mixture of disgust and satisfaction. "You've brought shame to this family," Jeremiah shouted, his voice carrying across the yard. "Two girls. What use are two more mouths to feed with no hands to work the land?" On a blanket nearby lay two swaddled infants, their cries joining their mother's. "Please," the young woman begged, her voice breaking. "They're your grandchildren. They're innocent." "Elizabeth married my son to give him sons," Martha spat. "Not useless daughters." Thomas had seen enough. Stepping into the yard, he called out, "That's enough." 3 heads turned toward him in surprise. Elizabeth's tear-streaked face registered shock, then hope. "This is family business, Barrett," Jeremiah growled. "Best you move along." Thomas stood his ground, eyes moving from Elizabeth to the crying infants and back to Jeremiah. "Where's your son? Does James know what you're doing to his wife and children?" "James is working the north field," Martha replied coldly, "and he agrees. This girl has failed in her duties." Thomas moved closer, deliberately placing himself between Elizabeth and her tormentors. "Untie her, now." "You have no right," Jeremiah began, but Thomas cut him off. "I said untie her." His hand moved to the revolver on his hip, not drawing it but making his intention clear. No decent man punishes a woman for bearing children, regardless of their sex. A tense silence followed, broken only by the whimpering of the exhausted young mother and the cries of her babies. "You're making a mistake, Barrett," Jeremiah warned. "The only mistake here is what you're doing to your son's family," Thomas replied evenly. Turning to Elizabeth, he asked, "Where are your things?" In the cabin behind the main house," she whispered, disbelief in her voice. Thomas nodded and pulled out his knife, cutting the ropes that bound her wrists. As she slumped forward, he caught her, supporting her weight while she found her footing. "You can gather your belongings and your children," he said quietly. "You're coming with me." She belongs to this family, Martha protested. She belongs to herself, Thomas replied, helping Elizabeth toward her babies. And these children deserve better than to be raised by people who would harm their mother for bringing them into this world. Elizabeth looked up at him, confusion and gratitude warring in her eyes. Why would you help us? You don't even know me. Thomas's expression softened slightly. I know enough. No one deserves this kind of treatment, especially not for giving birth to healthy children. As Elizabeth gathered her twins, cradling them close, Thomas stood guard, his presence a silent warning to the Richardsons. When she returned with a small bundle of possessions, he took it from her, then carefully helped her onto Penny. You'll regret this, Barrett, Jeremiah called after them as Thomas led the horse away. The twins secured in their mother's arms, Thomas didn't look back. I've regretted many things in my life, he said to Elizabeth. This won't be one of them. As they made their way through town, curious eyes followed them, whispers already beginning to spread. Thomas knew life would become more complicated. But as he looked up at the young mother holding her daughters, something long dormant stirred within him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in 15 years. The journey to Thomas's ranch was slow and arduous. Elizabeth, still weak from childbirth and the beating, struggled to stay upright on Penny, while Thomas led the horse by the reins, walking alongside them. The twins, barely 2 weeks old, according to Elizabeth, had finally settled into an exhausted slumber against their mother's chest. I don't even know your full name, Elizabeth said softly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for the past hour. Thomas Barrett, he replied, his eyes scanning the horizon. And you're Elizabeth Richardson. Elizabeth Winters, before I married James, she corrected, a hint of her former self emerging through the pain, though I suspect I'm neither now. Thomas nodded, understanding the implications. By taking her from her husband's family, he had effectively severed her marriage in the eyes of frontier society. What are their names? He asked, gesturing to the sleeping infants. A small smile touched Elizabeth's cracked lips. This one is Emma, she said, looking down at the baby on her right. And this is Charlotte. James never even held them. When the midwife announced they were girls, he walked out and didn't come back. Thomas's jaw tightened. Some men don't deserve to be fathers. Did you ever have children, Mr. Barrett? Elizabeth asked tentatively. A shadow passed over Thomas's face. No, my wife Sarah died before we could. He didn't elaborate further, and Elizabeth didn't press dot as the sun began its descent. The Barrett ranch finally came into view, a modest 2-bedroom cabin with a large barn and corral. Nestled against a backdrop of rugged hills, it wasn't much compared to the Richardson property, but it was clean and solid, built by Thomas's own hands over the years. It's not what you're used to, Thomas said apologetically as he helped Elizabeth down from Penny. It looks peaceful, she replied, her eyes taking in the simple structure. Peace is something I haven't known in a long time. Once inside, Thomas quickly prepared the spare bedroom, which had stood empty since he built the addition 5 years ago. He changed the sheets, dusted the furniture, and brought in fresh water while Elizabeth tended to the twins. You can stay here as long as you need, he explained, showing her to the room. There's a lock on the door if it makes you feel safer. Elizabeth looked at him with surprise. You're giving us a room with a lock? This is your space now, Thomas said simply. Your privacy matters. Tears welled in Elizabeth's eyes. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. There's nothing to repay. Rest now. We'll talk more in the morning. Later that night, after ensuring Elizabeth and the twins were settled, Thomas sat on his porch, pipe in hand, contemplating the day's events. The logical part of him recognized the foolishness of his actions. Taking in a married woman and her children would bring nothing but trouble from the Richardsons, who weren't known for their forgiveness. But watching Elizabeth tend to her daughters with such gentle devotion, despite her injuries, had awakened something protective in him that he couldn't ignore. "What have you gotten yourself into, old man?" he muttered to himself, exhaling a cloud of smoke into the cool night air. The sound of soft footsteps behind him made him turn. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket. "The girls are asleep," she said quietly. "I thought I should explain. About today," Thomas gestured to the empty chair beside him. "You don't owe me any explanations." Elizabeth sat gingerly, mindful of her injured back. "I was 17 when I married James," she began anyway. "My father died, leaving my mother with debts. The Richardsons offered to clear them if I married their son. It seemed like salvation at the time." Thomas listened silently as she continued. "James wanted sons, strong boys to help with the ranch and carry on the Richardson name. When the midwife announced twins, there was such joy. Until she said they were girls." Elizabeth's voice cracked. "James stormed out. His parents waited until I was strong enough to stand before they for today." "And you've been married for how long?" 3 years, she replied. 3 years of trying to be the perfect wife while being reminded daily that my only value was in producing sons." Thomas's weathered face softened with compassion. "Children are a blessing regardless of their sex. My Sarah would have given anything to hold a child of her own, boy or girl." Elizabeth studied him in the dim light from the cabin window. "You must have loved her very much." "Every day of our lives together," Thomas confirmed, "and every day since." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote and the gentle creaking of Thomas's rocking chair. "What happens now?" Elizabeth finally asked, the question hanging heavy in the night air. Thomas took a long draw from his pipe before answering. "For tonight you rest. Tomorrow we begin figuring out the rest." He paused, then added, "The Richardsons won't let this go easily. You should be prepared for that." Elizabeth nodded, a new determination visible in her posture despite her exhaustion. "I won't go back, Mr. Barrett. Not to that life. My daughters deserve better." "Thomas," he corrected gently. "If we're going to face this together, you might as well call me Thomas." "Thomas," she repeated, testing the name. "And I'm Elizabeth." Their eyes met briefly in the moonlight, an unspoken understanding passing between them, two wounded souls finding unexpected alliance in the vastness of the Arizona territory. "Get some sleep, Elizabeth," Thomas said kindly. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." As she rose to return to her room, Elizabeth paused. "Why did you really help us today? The truth." Thomas considered the question, then answered honestly. "Because 15 years ago, no one was there when Sarah needed help. And I couldn't live with myself if I walked away from someone else who did." The first light of dawn had barely touched the horizon when Thomas awoke to the sound of soft humming coming from the kitchen. For a disorienting moment, he thought he was dreaming of Sarah again. She used to hum while preparing breakfast, a habit he had both teased and treasured. But as full consciousness returned, he remembered the events of yesterday and the 3 new occupants of his home. Rising from bed, he dressed quickly and made his way to the kitchen, where he found Elizabeth carefully preparing a simple breakfast. With one arm while cradling Charlotte against her shoulder with the other, Emma lay swaddled in a makeshift bed fashioned from a drawer lined with blankets. "You didn't need to do that," Thomas said, startling her slightly. Elizabeth turned, a hesitant smile on her face. "It's the least I could do. I hope you don't mind that I use some of your supplies." "What's mine is yours while you're here," he replied, moving to the stove to inspect her handiwork, a pot of oatmeal and coffee brewing. "Though I usually just have coffee in the mornings. A man needs proper food if he's working from sunrise to sunset," Elizabeth said firmly. "My father taught me that." Thomas didn't argue, instead taking a seat at the table and watching as she efficiently managed cooking and child caring simultaneously. Despite her injuries and the trauma of yesterday, there was a quiet dignity in her movements, a resilience that impressed him. "I need to ride into town today," he said as she placed a bowl before him. "We need supplies, especially for the little ones." Elizabeth's face paled. "The Richardsons will be looking for you," Thomas finished her thought. "I know, but they'll be watching the roads out of the county, not the general store. Besides, people have already seen us together." "Hiding won't change that," she nodded reluctantly. "What should I do while you're gone?" "Rest," he said simply. "Your back needs time to heal, and there's plenty of water in the well behind the house if you need it." After breakfast, Thomas saddled Penny and prepared for the ride to town. Before leaving, he handed Elizabeth a rifle. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked. Elizabeth took the weapon with familiar ease. "My father taught me," said a woman alone. "Needs to protect herself." "Your father was a wise man," Thomas replied with approval. "I don't expect trouble, but just in case, one shot in the air will carry for miles in this country. I'll come running." The trip to Willow Creek was tense, with Thomas constantly scanning the surroundings for signs of the Richardsons or their men. The town itself seemed unusually quiet as he tied Penny outside the general store, several townspeople averting their eyes as he passed. Inside, Mr. Holloway, the storekeeper, greeted him with uncharacteristic reserve. "Mr. Barrett, didn't expect to see you back so soon." "Need some additional supplies," Thomas replied evenly, placing his list on the counter, "including things for infants." Holloway's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. Well, word travels fast in these parts, Mr. Barrett. The Richardsons were in earlier, offering a reward for information about their daughter-in-law and grandchildren." Thomas's expression remained neutral. "Is that so?" $50 is a lot of money," Holloway continued, watching Thomas carefully. "Makes folks consider where their loyalties lie." "And where do yours lie, Mr. Holloway?" Thomas asked quietly. The storekeeper held his gaze for a long moment before sighing. "I've known you 15 years, Thomas. Never known you to involve yourself in others' affairs without good reason." He began gathering the items on Thomas's list. "I also remember how the Richardson boy treats that poor girl. Seen the bruises myself when she'd come to town." Relief washed through Thomas. "I appreciate your discretion. Don't thank me yet," Holloway warned, lowering his voice. "James Richardson was in here an hour ago, drunk and angry. Said his wife stole his children and ran off with you. Said he was going to get them back, one way or another." Thomas's hand instinctively moved closer to his revolver. "Did he say when?" "No, but he bought ammunition before he left." Holloway finished packing Thomas's supplies. "Whatever you're planning, you'd best do it quick. That family has the sheriff in their pocket too." Thanking Holloway, Thomas paid and hurried outside, securing the supplies to Penny's saddle. As he mounted, he noticed a group of men gathered outside the saloon, James Richardson among them, watching him with undisguised hostility. Thomas urged Penny into a trot, heading out of town as casually as he could manage. Once out of sight, he spurred her into a gallop, racing back toward the ranch with growing concern. He arrived to find Elizabeth hanging laundry behind the house, the twins napping nearby in their drawer cradle. The rifle leaned against the wall, within easy reach. "We need to talk," Thomas said without preamble, dismounting quickly. "James is gathering men in town. They'll be coming here." Elizabeth's hands froze mid-motion, a wet cloth dripping onto the dusty ground. "When?" "Soon. Today, possibly." Thomas began unloading the supplies. "We have decisions to make and not much time to make them." Inside, they sat at the kitchen table, the gravity of their situation settling between them. "We could run," Elizabeth suggested. "Head to California or Oregon." Thomas shook his head. "With 2 newborns? We wouldn't make it through the territories. Winter's coming, and the mountain passes will be closing soon." Then what? I won't let them take my daughters, Elizabeth said fiercely. Thomas considered their options. There's a small mining town about 3 days' ride north, Silver Pine. I have a friend there, Samuel Wilson. He's the local preacher. If we could get there, he might help us. 3 days with twins is risky, Elizabeth pointed out. Staying here is riskier, Thomas countered. The Richardsons know where to find us, and they have numbers on their side. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears of frustration. This is my fault. I've brought this trouble to your doorstep. Thomas reached across the table, hesitantly placing his hand over hers. No, the fault lies with men who believe they own their wives and children like property. You deserve better, Elizabeth. So do Emma and Charlotte. Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Thomas moved quickly to the window, his expression hardening as he spotted a cloud of dust on the horizon. They're coming, he said grimly. At least 5 riders. Elizabeth paled but stood resolutely. What do we do? Thomas's mind raced through. They're limited options. Get the girls and whatever you need for them. There's a root cellar behind the barn. It's well hidden. Take the rifle and go there now. What about you? She asked, already moving to gather the twins. I'll try to reason with them first, Thomas replied, checking his revolver. If that fails, I'll buy you time to escape through the back of the cellar. It opens to a small canyon. Follow it north until you reach the creek, then head east. I'll find you. Elizabeth paused at the door, the twins cradled against her chest. Thomas ... Be careful. He nodded, watching as she hurried toward the barn, before turning his attention back to the approaching riders. Standing on his porch, revolver holstered but ready, Thomas Barrett prepared to make his stand against the men who thought they could claim ownership over a woman's life and her children's future. The riders approached in a cloud of dust, the thunder of hooves breaking the afternoon quiet. Thomas stood firm on his porch, one hand resting near his holster, the other hanging loosely at his side. He recognized James Richardson at the front, his face contorted with rage, even from a distance. Behind him rode his father Jeremiah, the sheriff, and 2 ranch hands Thomas didn't know by name. They reined in their horses about 20 yards from the cabin, spreading out in a loose semicircle. Thomas noted with grim satisfaction that they positioned themselves as men expecting trouble, not as visitors coming to talk. "Barrett!" James shouted, his voice slurred with alcohol. "Where's my wife? Where are my daughters?" Thomas stepped forward, keeping his voice level. "Your wife and children aren't here, James." "Liar!" James spat, dismounting clumsily. "Everyone in town saw you ride off with them yesterday." Sheriff Miller, a thin man with a perpetually sour expression, spoke up. "Thomas. Barrett, I'm here on official business. Elizabeth Richardson has been reported missing, along with her infant children. As her legal husband, James has every right to reclaim his family. Is that what you call it, Sheriff?" Thomas replied coolly, "Reclaiming? Like their lost property?" "The law's clear on this matter," Jeremiah Richardson interjected. "A woman belongs with her husband, and children with their father." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "And does the law say anything about whipping a woman for giving birth to girls instead of boys? Does it say a father can reject his children for their sex?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "We're not here to discuss family matters, Barrett. We're here to bring Elizabeth and those children home where they belong." "Home?" Thomas couldn't keep the disgust from his voice now. "I found her tied to a post, being whipped while her babies cried nearby. Is that what you call home?" James took another step forward, his hand moving to his gun. "That's none of your business, old man. Now I'm not asking again." "Where is my family?" Thomas held his ground. "Gone, James, somewhere you won't find them." "Search the property," Jeremiah ordered the ranch hands, who immediately dismounted and headed toward the barn. "This is private property," Thomas warned. "You have no right. I have every right," the sheriff interrupted, finally dismounting. "I have reason to believe you're harboring a woman against her husband's wishes. That's enough for me to search these premises." Thomas knew he was outnumbered and outgunned. Fighting now would only get him killed, leaving Elizabeth and the twins without protection. He needed to buy time, to keep them distracted while Elizabeth hopefully made her escape through the root cellar's back exit. "Search all you want," Thomas said, spreading his hands. "But they're not here." For the next 20 minutes, the men tore through his cabin and outbuildings, appending furniture, breaking what couldn't be moved, and destroying what little he owned in their frantic search. Thomas watched impassively, silently counting the minutes, praying Elizabeth had enough time to get safely away. Nothing in the house or barn. One of the ranch hands reported. James kicked over Thomas's kitchen table in frustration. "She has to be here. Where else would she go?" "Perhaps Mr. Barrett helped her leave the territory," the sheriff suggested, eyeing Thomas suspiciously. "Stage left for Tucson yesterday afternoon." Jeremiah Richardson approached Thomas, standing toe-to-toe with him. "If you've helped her leave the state with my son's children, that's a federal offense. You'll hang for kidnapping." "I haven't kidnapped anyone," Thomas replied evenly. "Elizabeth made her own choice to leave an abusive situation, as any person with dignity would." James lunged forward suddenly, drawing his pistol and pressing it against Thomas's temple. "Tell me where they are, or I swear to God I'll kill you." "Right here." "James," Jeremiah barked, "put that away. Dead men can't talk." The younger Richardson hesitated, his hand shaking with rage and whiskey, before reluctantly lowering his weapon. "We'll find them with or without your help, Jeremiah," promised Thomas. "And when we do, you'll answer for this interference." A sudden cry, barely audible but unmistakably that of an infant, drifted from the direction of the barn. 6 heads turned simultaneously, and Thomas's heart sank. "The cellar," one of the ranch hands called out, already running toward the sound. Thomas made a split-second decision and drew his revolver, firing a warning shot into the air. "Stay where you are," he commanded. The sheriff and the Richardsons immediately drew their weapons, creating a standoff. "Put it down, Barrett," the sheriff ordered. "Don't make this worse than it already is." "I won't let you take them," Thomas said firmly, his revolver unwavering. "Not back to that house. Not to people who would harm a mother for the crime of bearing daughters." James sneered. "They're my children, my blood. You have no say in this. A man who rejects his children at birth has no right to call himself their father," Thomas replied coldly. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then, from behind the barn, emerged Elizabeth, holding both twins close to her chest, the rifle slung across her back. Her face was tear-streaked but determined. "I'm here," she called out, her voice stronger than Thomas had ever heard it. "I won't hide anymore." "Elizabeth," Thomas warned, not taking his eyes off the armed men. "Go back." She ignored him, walking forward until she stood beside him on the porch. "These are my daughters," she said clearly. "Not property to be claimed, mine to protect and raise." James took a step toward her, his expression darkening. "You ungrateful." "Stay back," Thomas warned, his finger tightening on the trigger. Elizabeth faced her husband squarely. "I won't go back with you, James. Not now, not ever. You rejected these children the moment you learned they were girls. You've lost the right to call yourself their father." "The law says differently," Jeremiah reminded her coldly. "Then change the law." A new voice called from the road. All heads turned to see a wagon approaching, driven by Mr. Holloway from the general store. Beside him sat his wife and 3 other women from town, including the midwife who had delivered the twins. The wagon stopped, and Mrs. Holloway stepped down, walking purposefully toward the group. "We've come to bear witness," she announced, her stern gaze sweeping over the Richardsons, "to what happens here today." The sheriff lowered his gun slightly. This isn't your concern, Martha. When a new mother is whipped for bearing healthy children, it becomes everyone's concern, Mrs. Holloway replied sharply. She turned to Elizabeth. We've prepared a place for you and your daughters at our home in town, child. If you wish it. Elizabeth's eyes widened in surprise. Why would you help me? Because it's right, the midwife spoke up. I've delivered babies in this county for 30 years, and I've never seen such cruelty as what happened at the Richardson place. It's not Christian, and it's not human. Thomas felt some of the tension leave his body as he realized they were no longer alone in this fight. The presence of respected townswomen changed the dynamics considerably. This is ridiculous. Jeremiah sputtered. You can't interfere in a family matter. When that family matter involves abuse, we most certainly can, Mrs. Holloway countered. She addressed the sheriff directly. Will you uphold the law that protects property, John Miller, or the higher law that protects the innocent? The sheriff looked uncomfortable, glancing between the Richardsons and the determined women. Finally, he holstered his weapon. I can't force a woman to return to a situation where she fears for her safety or that of her children. Not without a judge's explicit order. This isn't over, James growled, but the fight seemed to be draining from him as he realized the town was turning against them. It is for today, Thomas said firmly, keeping his revolver raised. Now get off my property. After a tense standoff, Jeremiah nodded curtly to his son and the ranch hands. They mounted their horses and began to ride away, James throwing one last venomous look over his shoulder. You'll regret this, he called out. All of you. Only when they were out of sight did Thomas finally lower his weapon, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. Elizabeth turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. You were willing to die for us, she whispered, the realization seeming to overwhelm her. Some things are worth fighting for, Thomas replied simply. Mrs. Holloway approached them, her expression kind but practical. The offer stands, Elizabeth. You and your daughters can stay with us in town. You'll be safer there, with more eyes watching over you. Elizabeth looked from Mrs. Holloway to Thomas, indecision clear on her face. She's right, Thomas said gently. You'll be safer in town, surrounded by people who can help with the babies. But what about you? Elizabeth asked. They'll come back. They'll blame you for all of this, Thomas smiled faintly. I've handled worse. Besides, I think I'm overdue for a visit to that mining town I mentioned. Silver Pine. Might be good to see my old friend Samuel after all these years. Understanding dawned in Elizabeth's eyes. A fresh start? For all of us, if you're willing, Thomas confirmed, glancing at the twins. There's a whole world beyond. Willow Creek, Elizabeth. Places where Emma and Charlotte can grow up free from the shadow of the Richardson name. Elizabeth looked down at her daughters, then back to Thomas. In that moment, something passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but the foundation of something perhaps more important. Trust, respect, and the promise of possibility. I think, she said slowly, that I'd like to see this Silver Pine for myself, once the girls are a bit stronger for travel. Thomas nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. Then that's what we'll do. As the women helped Elizabeth and the twins into the Holloway's wagon, Thomas looked out over his ranch, the home he had built and maintained alone for 15 years. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time since Sarah died, he felt something like hope stirring in his chest. Sometimes, he reflected, the family you choose is more real than the one you're born into. And sometimes helping a stranger can lead you back to yourself.